I think the 21st century is a time for women's leadership to emerge in a new way. Part of what I speak about is 3 characteristics that women have that are necessary to solving the challenges of the 21st century. One is the long view. Women have the long view. It's born into us by being, doesn't really matter whether you have been one to carry children. Women care for children, and by caring for children, that is the essence of the long view. The second is that we are sort of built to, we put the tough issues on the table, in the home, in the workplace, in the community. We have some pretty significant tough issues that require the long view. And the third is that women are by our very nature connectors. Women are connectors whether they intend to be or not. Some people are very purposeful about it, but we are whether we are purposeful or not. It's just who we are. There's something about women and women's voices and a new form of women understanding the power that we hold and accepting that power, like embracing it. And some people are turning that into conversation about women having to run for office a lot, all of which is important. I don't think women's leadership needs to take a certain shape. I think it doesn't matter. It's recognizing your power, and then you lead in endless ways. And it's endless. It doesn't have a shape to it. It's not just about certain types of things, because we lead as individuals. You're leading in this endeavor. You need to run for office to do this. You're leading. We lead by taking initiative and doing things that need to be done. In that case, that brings optimism to me around wilderness and around wild places, because women will help children get outside and the whole process renews itself.
That, I guess, is the message I really want to convey. It is that broad-based grassroots activism and willingness to advocate and believe that we have a voice and then use that voice that is going to make a difference, if any difference is to be made.
I found myself with a friend flying over Africa for 2 summers in his small Cessna. I was co-pilot in the right seat, and I kept looking out that window and saying to my friend, it's so obvious, where there's no water, there's no life. The continent of Africa is basically, for the most part, gray and brown Miambo woodlands, but then there are these green ribbons that are sort of thrown down on the land, and that's where there are rivers, that's where there are lake shores, that's where you can see in a little plane flying low the animals, the local manadas of the people who live there. It's all right there in those little green ribbons.
And this is really the role of our organization as Great Old Broads for Wilderness. We're really about engaging and igniting the activism of elders, and then bringing that to the whole community. In our country, we're fortunate in that the citizen voice can make a difference. And whether you speak at a public hearing, or whether you use your voice to educate others, or whether you're going out on the ground and doing survey work to determine, what changes are needed to be made to public lands, where there should be wilderness, where we need better protection from oil and gas development, where we need better protection from, animal agriculture, or from whatever it might be that's changing the face of the landscape. It's the citizen voice that's going to make a difference. I think we're at a point where we need to take to the streets, and we need to show that, the direction we're heading is not viable.
Uranium mining was that was a tough group of people who were involved in that, and they regarded me and other environmentalists, and we really were not regarded as legitimate in our in our opposition to uranium. I started as this. I now realize I was rather young, and I was female, which was not at that point a very male-dominated legislature. That wasn't going to carry me very far. I went on a tour of a uranium mine with a senator who was also employed by, so he's a state senator and employed by a uranium company during the time of the year that he wasn't a state senator. And he said, well, if uranium were really dangerous, I'd put a big lump of it in my pocket, and that way I wouldn't go around getting women pregnant or something like that. And I was down in a mine with him, and he's throwing a piece back and forth, and I'm thinking what I know about particulate matter. So I wish you wouldn't do that, but we were in different, in really different worldviews, and that's the time at which Karen Silkwood was killed, just shortly thereafter. And so it was a very rough industry, and I saw bribery occurring. I had young legislators who were friendly with me. It was kind of an open secret how corrupt the industry's relationship was. We had a progressive governor, Governor Tony Anaya, who appointed me first as Secretary of Finance Administration, and then I moved over to become head of the Environment Department. And I was in this atmosphere in which we had a state law which told us that we couldn't regulate uranium mill tailings, which the mill tailings are more radioactive, but there are waste streams associated with that. And we had a state law that prevented more stringent regulation, but we had the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which said that under new regulations that we had to regulate to a higher level. And it was clear that the industry/state legislature wasn't going to let us do that. And so I went back to Washington, went to Bethesda, met with the members of or staff people at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and said that New Mexico was not interested, was really not able to operate this delegated program from the NRC. And so we signed a document returning jurisdiction of the uranium industry, those aspects that were covered under the agreement, back to the NRC. And again, I knew things would be bad. Well, this time I was better prepared because I was a cabinet officer, but I wasn't necessarily prepared for Senator Domenici chewing me out the next day, and actually, saying, I'll get you for this. You will have consequences for what you've done, because he had assumed that it would have been an environmental group suing to get the program back under federal control, and the law had been carefully written so that if that happened, he'd actually gone back and gotten amendments to it, so it'd be very difficult to take control away from a state. But they never thought that a state would just go back and offer the program back. Protection of the environment was really not seen as legitimate, and the people who were concerned about uranium were not seen as having any real role in state policy, although the governor agreed with me for that time. But the program that has remained in place, and the NRC has continued to operate some parts of the regulation of the industry, which is the next problem, of course, became one of remediation after the companies were gone. And it was quite predictable that we were going to be left with piles of waste, and so we were, and that remains an issue within the state.
Where there's no water, there's no life. I had the title, and then I had to create the focus of what I was going to do with that title. I thought originally my project would be about Africa, but I decided, partly due to the pressure of my daughter, who was so focused on American environmental issues, and kept saying to me, why do you go to Africa? Why don't you do your own country, Mom? I decided to do both. And then I could have a comparison of how we treat our land and our rivers in developed nations versus developing nations. And that's been a fascinating journey for me. There's similarities, there are differences, there are things that developing nations can learn from us and that we can learn from them.
I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, in Illinois, but out in the country, or kind of right on the border between kind of suburban and country. And to me, as a kid, every waking moment I could, I was climbing trees, I was hunting frogs in ponds, I was falling out of trees, my knees were always bloody, I lived outside. I was like this wild child. And you know, when you're a kid, you know, you don't really know what wilderness is or what wild is. But for me, just being outside and looking at any animal I could and slithering around on my stomach and again, just kind of seeing whatever was there, turtles, whatever birds, whatever was available. My parents were big birders, so they were a huge influence on me being outside.
My mother used to take us camping, my sister and I camping, when my father had to work, and she would just take us out for a week, and we would go someplace in Northern California and just enjoy every minute of it. She loved it too, and it was just, I'm very fortunate. That's how I got started.
As we sit here celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, it sort of prompts me to look back 50 years and realize that this fall, 50 years ago, I was probably on the back of a horse in western New Jersey. And I would spend my weekends and my days in the summer getting up when the sun came up, putting on a backpack, filling it with breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a book. And I'd leave a note for my parents saying, oh, I promise to be back before dark. And as long as I did that, it was okay. And then the area I lived in was rolling hills, dairy farms, dirt roads, and lots of wilderness. Not formal designated wilderness, but to me, it was the world. And I loved that.
I am a very fortunate person because as a child, my parents took me camping in Northern California, and I learned to appreciate the beauty of the outdoors and just being out there. When I was about 12, my sister was 11, my father and my mother and I and my sister went on a 6-week camping trip. We had a teardrop trailer, a little teardrop trailer, and a guitar. I can remember one night all of us were sleeping in that teardrop trailer when it rained very hard.
I grew up in the Maryland suburbs, and my parents knew about Rachel Carson somehow, so they bought her books, and we would go down and look at tide pools, and neither of my parents had any background in this, but there was a respect for the natural world. And then as the neighborhood that we grew up, so the greater DC area was subjected to the strip malls and the highways and so on, of course, which has only grown exponentially. But my parents had a book around the house. It was called, I think it was called The Ugliest Street in America, but that probably wasn't the real title, but it was just a book about strip malls. And so I started becoming aware of the despoilation of the natural world at that time. And
I think we all have a deep hunger for wild places, a deep hunger for something that's mysterious, for something that where we aren't in control, where we don't know the answers. And for a child, I think that can be expressed in the backyard, just digging in the dirt, watching an earthworm, seeing a butterfly fly by, just feeling the power of a thunderstorm, seeing a rainbow. You can have those experiences in urban places, and you can connect with that innate part of ourselves that yearns for the wild.
Being outside is the way to make the world, put the world to rights, to actually find the ability to understand or be at peace with the complexities and chaos of the world as we see it, to find the center, to attach to your purpose, whatever it may be. It doesn't really matter. Everyone has different purpose. It doesn't always have to be tied to the wilderness setting. Wilderness is the place for us where we can find ourselves.
I lived next to a wonderful gurgling stream I could hear every night going to bed, and the owls hooting, and there were frogs around the pond grumphing all night in the summer. So I grew up loving the country. I was a country girl. And now I'm living in New York City, so go figure. But New York's a base for me now.
But I think as a child you may not really fully understand that until you have a chance to be away from humanity, away from all of the trappings of our social worlds, and really experience truly what it means to be where you can't see another light at night except for the stars, where you can sit by a stream and feel the power and the calmness, that tension of power and calmness together. I think that is truly what makes us whole, to know the full tapestry that nature provides to us.
I finally realized a few years ago that it's my passion, really, because when I had to make a decision about whether or not to become a teacher or be a medical technologist, which I had planned on doing for a year in college, I finally realized that I want to be a teacher because I will have 3 months off every summer to go camping and backpacking and hiking. And I just knew that that was really, really important to me. And so I decided to be a teacher.
If you just taped the voice changes that people have when they talk about their childhood haunts and their love affair with this creek or that piece of woods or that place where they found the magic of imagination and being outside. People's voices change when they talk about it.
I think it's very easy to feel disconnected from the very basics. You know, where does clean water come from? Where does clean air come from? But when you're out in that, you feel that connection more and more. And what I love about being in a wild place for an extended period of time is I don't live by the clock. I live by the seasons, I live by the weather, I live by the rhythms of the land, and when you live that way, even if it's just for a couple days, but you feel that I think that wildness that's in us, it's in our DNA. I think it's just been so buried, you know, by the trappings of civilization. But when you just feel that for just a short amount of time, I have never felt more alive in my entire life than when I'm in a wild place. And I think it just because it just touches the essence of what we really are. Not who we used to be, but what we still are.
I think nature and the beauty of nature, and I'm not a religious person, but I think it's what I would call sacred. It's something that should never be destroyed. It's something that should be appreciated by everyone, and it's sad that some people don't even know enough about it and haven't had experiences with it to know that.
I knew I didn't want to do studio photography. I knew I didn't want to do wedding photography. I wanted to photograph that which I loved when I grew up, and so I became a nature photographer.
People who live in a city all their lives and grow up with cement and that's it, I think psychologically they're really needing something else, and that's nature. I think giving these people that experience of being in nature so they'll know what we need to protect and how important that is.
So I guess for us and our kids, for all of us, it's the place where real communication occurs, both verbal and nonverbal, where the setting itself settles us and calms us in ways that no other part of the world does, no other piece of our life does.
When I decided that I really had a passion for the environment, the natural environment, nature, the beauty of nature, I knew that this was what I should really spend my life on, my purpose in life. Even though I'm not as young as I would have liked to have been when I started with that idea, still, I think it's not too late.
Wellness designation was a revolutionary idea. I mean, to your point about, we talked about before we were taping about the early version of pilgrims and the, seeing the natural setting as of evil spirits or devils, and we've recast it to, at minimum, a source of spiritual renewal for many people. And at some places, it's actually the sort of water begins almost always in the high peaks, in the high mountains. Glaciers provide the water that makes it possible for all living beings and plants and animals to go forward. So wilderness is the source of life in many cases for us. Even in places like the Badlands or in deserts, big wild deserts, it's still the source of life. So recasting it from first, when David Brower knows, it was all about high peaks and dramatic settings, and we've understood the whole notion of what wilderness is has changed over time, and there's a new definition. There's a new narrative about wilderness that needs to emerge now, very quickly, because it is, in a sense, a connection to life on this planet, and understanding how we can live in harmony on the planet with each other and natural places. Those stories are best told in the context of what we call wildlands.
Much of this is about education. And as far as I'm concerned with water issues, it's about first understanding, where does your water come from? You talk to people in cities and they say, from my faucet. Well, where does that come from? Well, I don't know. So that's a big hurdle. And if we can pass that hurdle, get people to be aware of their watershed and where their water comes from and what happens to it on the way from its original source to their faucet, then you're going to get more grassroots. And then you'll get more action happening to take care and protect the delivery of our water.
If you're going to communicate and you're going to get other people excited, you better not be talking about policy all the time. While it's critically important, you've got to get people, emotionally excited about this stuff. And as storytellers, that's our job. I mean, we're hitting the heart. We're not trying to hit up here. If you hit the heart, that will follow. But if you're just going to the brain, it's like, there's just not a lot of oomph there. And so, as communicators, for me, I just think, just step back and remember, like, why you got involved in this in the first place, and remember all those times that you've had out in wild places and how it made you feel.
I mean, if you think about it, for most of us, when we think about the place where we feel most tranquil, where we feel most whole, if you ask a room of people to close their eyes and imagine that place, I think most people, even if they haven't had an opportunity to spend a lot of time outdoors, are going to come up with a place where they have the sun shining on them, where they might be by a stream, where they have plants growing near them. That is just the place we as humans who evolved in nature, I think, feel most whole.
When I was much younger, I had a very different sense of what I thought wilderness was. And my definition of wilderness is constantly evolving, and it's still changing every time I'm out there. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that wilderness is this incredible teaching tool for human beings. When I'm out in wilderness, I finally realized what it means to be human. And it sounds really strange. It's like, wait a minute, like you have to go to the wild to figure out what it means to be a human being, and that's exactly what it has taught me. So it's been such an incredible teaching tool. So I think when we're communicating that to other people, sometimes I think we leave people out of the wilderness equation, and we just talk about, the beauty and the beauty of the wild, why this is important for wildlife, and those are, again, all very, very important things. But it's like, I have learned how to be a human being by being out really in these lands from which we came from. And that's priceless, that's invaluable. And that's a lesson that we can teach to anybody, whether or not they ever want to go to a place like that.
We can't own the land. The land owns us, and are given us permission to be here. We just keep abusing our permission. We keep abusing our license. We keep trying to stretch it to untenable places.
But I think we are all united in our sense that the protection of wild places is essential for the survival of humanity. And we believe that that is something we must commit ourselves to in order to be sure that all future generations have the opportunity to know the call of the wild.
I can't walk away from working on climate change. For me, that's an investment at a broader level in this exquisite planet that we have the honor of calling home.
I guess the word I often use is, we've become complacent. We've got it good, and why bother, And I hope that, it's sad to say that this is, it might take something like climate change and the flooding of our streets and the tornadoes and hurricanes and fires and all of these almost biblical kinds of things happening before we say, okay, enough, we've got to change things. But, I think that complacency can be dangerous.
It's not about the planet surviving. The planet's going to survive. We may not recognize it. We're at risk. And other life as we know it in terms of birds and plants and animals, this magical world we live in that every day I'm just like, wow.
I'm going to quote my wonderful, all of our, I guess, wonderful mentor, Ed Abbey, and I so take this to heart, and sometimes I really have to remember this, but he always says, it's not enough to fight for the land. Get out there and enjoy it.
When I first got into wilderness advocacy, I found out that not everybody went outside, that were wilderness advocates in the DC world. I was just like,
my stories are so much richer when I'm out there, I'm in it, I'm just absorbing it, and then I come back, and then I'm writing my stories or telling my stories. They're so much richer. And I think sometimes in this whole communicating of conservation, I think we actually forget that. And we're the ones that are immersed in it, and yet either we just assume everybody else is immersed in it and they know how wonderful it is too, or I think sometimes we forget. I don't think we get out enough and enjoy it.
the other thing I think that's important is to remember about protecting anything is that part of the joy of the work, and there is a continuous thread of work, and that is giving voice to individuals who care. So my earliest conservation work occurred on the reservation when I really literally went into Flagstaff and learned that nobody had even thought to inform the two tribes for whom the San Francisco Peaks are sacred that there was a threat. Nobody had even thought to tell them. So I went back to Tuba City that night, and I happened to have an aide, both a Navajo and Hopi aide in my classroom, and it was a crazy Jeep. Why the school owned this Jeep, I have no idea. It was like, really? Why? We owned this Jeep that had one of those old microphones on the top, so you were in a parade, you could call out, County Commissioner Jones. They're anachronistic now, nobody has those things, but there was this beautiful Sony Jeep with one of those. So we would get out of school starting that afternoon about 2, 3 o'clock and go just bouncing around in the back roads, no roads really, all over the reservation, announcing in my brutally just wretched Navajo, and then they would laugh at me and the aide would take the microphone and fix it, that there was a hearing in Flagstaff on such and such an afternoon on a Tuesday at 6:30, and if they wanted to participate, they should come to the post office in Tuba City by about 4 o'clock, and I invited 5 or 6 other teachers to, if people showed up. I thought maybe 5 people would show up, and you know, we did this for 2 weeks, sort of every afternoon for a while. And then I would go off and do, you know, coach girls running. I left school at 2:30. I got out of class. One of the other teachers covered for me for the last 30 minutes and drove my car to the Tuba City post office. There were 200 people there. And they had, in many cases, walked most of the day. Most of them were women, or ridden in the back of pickups because they were given an opportunity to speak. And no one did that. Well, I drove into that parking lot, and I can still remember the way I felt. I have tears in my eyes and panic at the same time, because I had 5 teachers who had committed a car that could hold 3 other people, perhaps, right? Well, that could take care of, like, you know, 20 people. And I was like, this is the most amazing moment. I'm like, what am I going to do? Well, I tracked down those days, that was the very beginning of any interracial leadership. So there was one woman on the school board who was Navajo, had a trailer. I went racing to her trailer because she could at least authorize school buses, even though it was illegal as all get out, because we didn't have any money and we didn't have any drivers. And she was breaking all the boundaries of her authority. She didn't have any authority to tell us we could get these school buses. But we did. And some drivers showed up, and we put this wild caravan together to Flagstaff. This was obviously pre-cell phone time. And I was most of the way there when I was like, oh my gosh, we didn't call and let them know, because the Coconino County Courthouse hearing room had probably held about 50 to 80 people. Well, there were going to be other people there, and we were driving in at 6 o'clock at night with a whole, and there wasn't a fair, there wasn't, you know, an art fair or some sort of other native thing, community gathering. Flagstaff had never seen anything like this. So I remember we had to pull off in Cameron and use a payphone and call the courthouse to try to inform them that they should consider moving the venue. And they were like, don't be ridiculous, because I don't think they believed me. So we pulled up on this tiny little street, Clay Avenue, in Flagstaff with 2 school buses and a bunch of cars. Like, I can't even remember how many cars anymore, and started unloading, and the place just like panic. They had to move the venue to the high school. It had to all happen right when the hearing was going to start. So the hearing ended at like 1 in the morning because we had 200 witnesses, right? And Navajos are given a chance to speak. They don't turn it down, right? They went to the microphone, and we had to find a translator. My point being that hasn't changed. That piece of life is not different today than it was then. The mechanisms that we would use for finding voice, giving people a voice, sometimes it's over the internet and videos and YouTube, and the need to be heard and to speak up for things that we care about, that hasn't changed. Nothing about that has changed. So not so much optimism, but just realistically speaking, human beings are always going to want to give voice to things they care about.
But it is the people who live there and their voice that's going to make the difference.
We took our kids camping quite a bit too. We were just looking at pictures not too long ago of, you know, the early videos or old-fashioned movies, and everybody just looks so happy, you know? And it's so beautiful where we went.
Well, I think the single most important thing that we need to be doing is every organization that cares and devotes part of its mission or its total mission, like the Wilderness Society, for example, to wilderness, needs to actually have a very significant piece of their work about getting kids outside. Period. And you really, if you're not doing that, you need to change. You need to see that as a piece of your work. Literally outside in the closest and most, get them outside, playing in a creek, playing in a meadow, playing in a park, because children come alive outside. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter where they were raised, doesn't matter what urban setting they're in. It's magic, and they see and feel the magic and find a way to play in it and sort of energize their own spirit. So I think we've become so much more urbanized all over the world that it's a part of a global redefinition of a commitment to wilderness is a commitment to getting kids outside and letting them find themselves in those settings.
I think children are born with a sense of wonder, and they're born with their emotions just at all levels. You know, they can be very quiet and curious, they can be just boisterous and, you know, rambunctious, and that all comes from that just connection to the root of our emotions and that sense of wonder about everything. As we grow older, maybe through our formal schooling, maybe it's just a process of aging, I think we often lose that sense of wonder and forget that that is a part of who we are. And there's something about nature that brings it out in every one of us, brings back that childlike curiosity and that complete sense of peacefulness and feeling at one inside your own skin. And I think I describe it when I'm in the wilderness as feeling tiny. You know, you get out into the mountains or in the vastness of the desert or sitting by the rolling waves at the sea, and what I feel more than anything is the sense of how small and insignificant I am. And that's a beautiful feeling. And I think it takes away, it strips away that ego that we have, that we develop, especially as adults, and particularly in our middle years, I think. We develop that sense of being very important. And I think as we grow older, we realize, you know, when you're around children, how you've lost that sense of wonder, and they bring it back, and somehow we're hungry for that as we get older. I think that there's no better place to experience that sense of wonder and that connection with our childlike sense and with our children in nature, in the beauty of the outdoors. Wherever we can be, where there's no walls and no ceiling.
Not just focusing on designation, but focusing on the love affair first, because you cannot move wilderness designation without passion. You can't have passion without connection. And connection is generated by children learning in their early years that's where you need to be to find who you are, even if who you are doesn't turn into being a wilderness advocate as a profession, right?
I think with young people, you know, instead of, again, projecting our own upbringing and our own experiences and expecting them to do the exact same thing, let's take a look at what they're doing, how they're communicating, how they're interacting with each other, maybe with nature, with wildlands, and just meet them where they are. And then also what I'm finding with the young generation is they don't really just want to like stand somewhere and read an interpretive sign. They actually want to interact, which I think is a much more powerful way actually to engage people. So maybe if we can be whether it's trails or interpretive exhibits or something to where you can actually interact a little bit more as opposed to just kind of having it be one-sided, you're standing there just reading something, but there's a way to actually interact, you know. I think that engages anybody, really.
It's really, really, really important to get kids out into the natural beauty of nature. And this is something that they're entitled to, really.
So being outside with our kids has always been the best way to be together as a family.
It's a very critical time right now. We really don't know what the future holds for us, and unless we make some significant changes in our lifestyles, we are in for a very rocky ride. So it's my hope that somehow through the grassroots activism that we encourage through Great Old Broads for Wilderness, that we can all get together and make it clear that we are directly integrated into the natural environment. We cannot survive without the natural environment, and we need to do everything we can to protect our air, our water, to protect this very fragile world that we are in. Climate change is a very difficult and frightening future that we have ahead of us, present that we're living, and we've got to use our abilities as activists, as citizens, as engaged people to make the policy changes that need to be made so that we do have a future that is whole.
And if we lose that water resource, we've lost a big food resource. So you can also say, no water, no food. That's it, and then no life. But water is the basis of it all. And the land that the water travels through, if the land is not healthy, then our water's not going to exist or be clean.
We need to think about community, and that community is not just the human community, but includes all the other than human community that we share this planet with.
One of the most critical parts of any watershed are the headwaters and the forests. Without those forests, there's a big problem. Without the forests, you can't store the water throughout the year. You can't store the snow melt. Without the forests, you end up with gullies, spring floods, water racing through, not trickling through and being slowly disseminated. Forests are critical. I mean, you can talk about forests with the whole climate change issue and the carbon storage, yes. But as to what really directly impacts the rivers, those roots are needed to hold the water when it comes down and the snow melt. So forests are really important. Forests, wetlands are such a gift to this planet. They're the nurseries for fish population. They are naturally purifying our water. These services all for free, supplying fish, cleaning our water. Half of our watershed, our wetlands in this planet are gone. We have plowed over them to create fields. We have plowed over them to create more housing developments. We never thought they were important. But the good news is we are learning. I think we've been slow learners, but we are learning, and there is more effort to recognize the value.
How do we pass what we've experienced in our generations to future generations? I think this generation, the generation preceding us, is really unique in that we've experienced changes in this world that perhaps no other generation has. When I think about, my grandparents and even my parents growing up in a time before there was plastic, before there were computers, of course, that was true for me as well, before there were cars, before there were airplanes, before there was color television or even television at all. For my grandparents, to think that they had gone from that place to where we are now, where everyone has their smartphone in their pocket and flies regularly and is moving at such a speed that was probably unimaginable to my grandparents. I realize what changes we've seen. And just in my lifetime, I think about what changes I've seen on the land, places that I used to go where you would see no one for days, to now there are hordes of people. There are big parking lots. There's a bathroom there at the trailhead. Places where I grew up, where we used to go out and play in the fields and streams that are now suburban developments, and places where cities used to be separated by long distances and have now grown together, connected by interstate highways. These are massive changes we've seen in our lifetime, and that's just what we can see. When we think about what we don't even see, but we know is happening, the acidification of oceans, the changing of the climate, the impact that we are having in every way on our ecosystems. I can't even imagine, another generation that has ever experienced such change. And these aren't positive changes.
Is water a universal right? Should we be paying for it? Would we honor the quality of our rivers, the quality of our freshwater resources, including aquifers, if there was a price attached to it? This is something that's going to become more and more important. And in the drought in California, the state of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in the Central Valley.
When Mark first ran for Congress in 1998, we talked about many things. How would it affect our children? How would we manage our life? We were, as everyone is, completely naive about the impact of that kind of choice. And because of our sense of the possible, based on years of running outward bound courses and living outside, we were just convinced that we would not be affected. That's humorous.
There's much more activism, but I think, our previous governor did, with respect to climate, for example, we were starting to put a cap and trade rule into place. We had put a rule in to protect, in oil and gas operations, there's produced water, it comes out along with the product, and it had been put into unlined pits and so on, was causing groundwater contamination. The previous governor had essentially allowed the Oil Conservation Commission to regulate it. The new governor came in on day one. She said, I'm repealing all of these regulations. While there's a lot of support, there's particularly support in, this is a majority-minority state with Hispanics and Native Americans. There's a great deal of support for environmental protection, but it's not the issue that people vote on. But like many Western states, about 1/6 of our general fund budget comes from oil and gas. So it's going to be a long time until people, in this state say, leave it in the ground, unlike some of the states where they're saying that. We are poor, and that is reflected in just any number of policies. So I was hired by students at PIRG. They were, maybe I was 2 years older than they were or something. I mean, they were kind of a funny group of bosses, but we worked on some very good campaigns, although one of the first things they had me do was to do a news conference denouncing two legislators who were trying to bring the whole nuclear fuel cycle to southern New Mexico, including what we now call the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. I had no idea that if you denounce the two senior legislators of the state in a news conference, that when you then went to lobby the legislature, all sorts of bad things would happen to you. So the uranium industry was a formidable foe and it really characterized, for me, what environmental politics were like in this state. The state was poor, and it is poor, and I think people, particularly in political offices, will say, we will take the nuclear waste of the country, we'll do uranium mining despite the risks it presents to our citizens, despite the pollution of water, despite all of the consequences from it, we'll take it because we're poor.
We're in a war right now. The words used politically are gridlock. And I think that word is used because it evokes a picture of, in DC or any urban setting where cars are all sitting, you can't cross an intersection and you can't turn left, you're sort of stuck right in this intersection. And certainly there's a validity to the image, but I think we probably should stop using it because I actually don't think that's accurate. I think it's more that we're in a specific stalemate over different visions for where this country is headed, which has led to the image of gridlock because we're pulling, and there's a sense of there's only one way to do it, which is my way. Wilderness designation is not the only thing suffering from this division and this war, if you will, between different visions for what the United States should be and going forward. It's one of many casualties of this locked moment until we can sort out how to manage moving forward, not getting everything one wants in sort of moving a vision forward, focusing more on what we have in common rather than what we have that separates us.
I resigned as head of the Environment Department after the elections, but the incoming governor fired me just to be sure that it really took, and I moved to California, where I became head of Citizens for a Better Environment, now Communities for a Better Environment, and it was like going to another planet. I would do that hitchhiking in from Berkeley, and when I told people where I worked, they would stop and buy me coffee or something, whereas in New Mexico, I was more likely to be shown the door or something. But the difference, this is a very poor state, and of course, California is a much, much wealthier one. And so I started to look at some of the academic research, and I was moving into as I had became a professor of law. It tends to be the case that poor states don't regulate very well, and really because we haven't had many new environmental laws since 1970. In this poor state, we're essentially living with the laws as they were passed in 1970. We've done a few things. We kind of protect groundwater, although we just weaken the regulations on copper mining, gold mining, dairies. It's not very good protection. We have a little bit of regulation of surface mining, but in general, we have the laws frozen in time as they were in 1970, and we don't go beyond that. And so states that have economies that are viewed as more diverse and having other sources of revenue have not taken the attitude that New Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, name the poor states, have taken towards environmental regulation. So when I got to California, it just became very clear to me that the relationship to the national government was quite different, and I have been a proponent of at least maintaining both federal and state regulation, because sometimes the federal government is better. And for a poor state like this, it's almost always the case that the federal government's better.
We did the Clean Water Act, we did the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and that was our golden hour as far as I'm concerned as I work with this project. We are still leaning so heavily on those enactments. They are unique. They have given us the leg to stand on to move forward to protect our land and our freshwater resources. They were absolutely essential. The other act/treaty legal leg to stand on that I am very grateful for is the 1853 treaty with Pacific Northwest tribes. When they were moved onto their reservations, the federal government felt that there was nothing wrong to agreeing with them, that they would always be allowed to have the same amount of salmon they've always had. Nobody in 1853 anticipated these monumental hydropower dams that would stop the flow of salmon. But that is in the treaty, that those Indian nations deserve those salmon. That's part of their culture, it's part of the health of that ecosystem. And that it is the Native Americans, both in Canada and the US, that have used that treaty to say, we need to take some dams down, we need fish hatcheries, we need bypasses. So yes, we have those federal acts you mentioned. We also have that 1853 treaty that saved the Columbia River Basin.
I feel very blessed to have grown up in a time when the environmental laws were coming into place, and in the 1970s when I was in high school, recognizing how significant that was, and I really became an environmentalist in high school. I feel so fortunate that our legislators and our citizens had the foresight to think about these things and really make some very dramatic changes from what you described, where air pollution, smog was something that was affecting every city, where the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, where there were declines in of so many species that have come back now. Some of these species have been successful in coming back after DDT was eliminated and other pesticides. So I do feel like I've lived in a very fortunate time, and certainly the United States of America has really been a leader in terms of bringing these environmental regulations into place. Unfortunately, at that same time, I think, you know, we've exported a lot of our industries that have now taken advantage of other countries that don't have those laws, and as well as the tax shelters and tax breaks that they get. And so while I feel I've been very fortunate, I also recognize that our impacts extend beyond our country's borders, and those laws need to be in place everywhere, and allowing for American companies to evade those laws by going outside of our country and being able to still make a profit without being responsible to the global community is extremely concerning.
I directed a multidisciplinary water resources program, and then joined the law faculty, and then President Clinton appointed me to head a commission on Western water, and we had Gail Norton had been on the commission but been removed by President Clinton, so that made our meetings in Colorado interesting. And I don't know, we said things that there have been so many Western water commissions and national commissions, and everybody says the same thing. We need national water policies. We need to emphasize sustainability. We need to make it possible for water to move from some of the uses established 100 years ago to new uses. And so we said many of those things. It was a fascinating process to get the report out, because I've always, I guess, had a impertinent tongue, and it wasn't clear, although Secretary Babbitt and I went on to become pals, but it wasn't clear how the Interior Department, and we were kind of under them or attached to them, how they felt about our work. And I made the quip that we were going to come out with a list of Western water projects that should be killed. And they didn't get my humor. This was before the first election. I was just kidding. But then when it came time to issue the report, it had become controversial on the Republican side in Congress. And one of the deputy assistant, whatever, undersecretary said, well, we're not sure we have money to print your report. And so I said, well, thank you. I called the Washington Post up and sent them an electronic copy. And I said, you know, it's up to you whether you print it or not, but it's been released, so you can do what you want. They did go ahead and print it, but it was pretty interesting work to do.
So the Wilderness Act in the United States, incredible piece of legislation. So that was passed in 1964. I was born in 1964, and so I just turned 50. The Wilderness Act just turned 50, and as you turn a little older, you know, you start looking back a little bit, and you start reflecting. And I'm so incredibly grateful to all the people, all these visionary people who came before me and worked so hard to get that act passed. I've been a direct beneficiary of that Wilderness Act. I have grown up with designated wilderness. I've spent my formative years in designated wilderness. I continue to spend as much time as I can in wilderness areas. So again, it's my turn. I'm stepping up. I'm doing whatever I can through my skills, which is photography and writing, collaborating with other groups that are working on preserving either already protected wilderness or working to preserve new wilderness. I'm definitely working on campaigns like that.
So I think we are at a point in society where we are due for some very serious reevaluation, and it needs to come quickly, as to what is the system that we want to be living in, so that we can ensure that there are future generations and there is a healthy and habitable earth upon which to live. We need to think about community, and that community is not just the human community, but includes all the other than human community that we share this planet with.
So my book is called Salmon in the Trees, Life in Alaska's Tongass Rainforest. And yes, everyone, the title takes people by surprise. They're like, what? How can there be salmon in the trees? And they say, oh, do you mean that's when, eagles carry the salmon up into the tree and they leave it there? And it's like, no, that's technically salmon up a tree. There are actually salmon in the trees, and then now I've got them. Now they're hooked. They're like, okay, tell me more. So the Tongass National Forest, this is in southeast Alaska. It is America's largest national forest by leaps and bounds. It is 17 million acres. It's about the size of the state of West Virginia. It is 3 times the size of the next largest national forest. It is a very, very large area. Contains 1/3 of the world's remaining old-growth coastal temperate rainforest, and it contains the largest reserves of old-growth forest left in the United States. Again, very, very special place. Salmon are born in freshwater streams and rivers, and they head out to the oceans to mature, and then somewhere along the line, depending on the species, after between 1 and 6 years, they return to that very burst stream where they were born, which in and of itself is just, to me, one of the most incredible feats of nature that they can do that. They're thousands of miles out in the ocean and they come back to that exact same stream. So when they come back in this part of Alaska, they come back in mass, just thousands and thousands, millions and millions of salmon are coming into more than 5,000 streams throughout this entire forest ecosystem. And when they come back, lots of hungry animals waiting for them, particularly bears. So this part of the world has some of the highest densities of both brown and black bears. And you can see why when you're up there. There's just millions of salmon for these bears to be feasting on. And turns out that the bears don't always just eat the salmon right in the river. A lot of times a bear will come down to the stream, pluck a salmon out, and immediately take off and go into the woods because it's trying to avoid conflict with other bears. Bears don't really get along with each other very well. So turns out these bears are moving incredible quantities of salmon into the forest. And what happens over time is all the nutrients from those salmon carcasses that are left there by the bears and get spread around by other animals, all the nutrients from those salmon bodies decompose into the forest floor, and the trees and other vegetation absorb them through their roots. And this is the scientific discovery part that's just so exciting, that pulls all this together. So scientists have discovered a form of marine nitrogen. It's called nitrogen-15. It comes from the ocean. They've discovered that nitrogen in trees near salmon streams that they can link directly back to the fish. And at times, this nitrogen in trees, it's miles and miles away from the ocean, and it can be football fields away from the actual stream itself. But it's the ocean coming into the forest in the bodies of salmon, delivered by the bears, and then absorbed through the trees. So there really are salmon in the trees. And so I thought, again, going back to storytelling, if I can help people understand just that one magnificent, remarkable, unexpected yet perfectly natural connection, they'd understand the entire ecology of that incredibly rare ecosystem in the Tongass without me ever having to get scientific. I don't even have to say the word, ecology or ecosystem. And so it's been really gratifying to go around and help people, especially in those communities within the Tongass National Forest, to help people understand what's in their backyard, and then help other Americans outside of Alaska understand that incredible connection, and that all of that 17 million acres has been entrusted to them.
So little by little, it's a little step forward, but we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. And the way the administrations, whichever they are so much more concerned with other topics than conservation. It can be very daunting and disturbing and discouraging for young people. But successes, or even partial successes, aren't achieved overnight, and young people get deterred. They think, oh, something hasn't happened, but it may take a lifetime. It may take a lifetime, and young people get busy with their lives and jobs and their families, and it's very hard to keep to a particular project to see some success.
If we could start thinking long term instead of short term, we'll win all these battles.